Hi everyone, I'm here with Wayne Brown today. He's a Senior Director of Financial Services at Alvarez and Marsal. Wayne, thanks very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to be here. We've known each other a few years, haven't we, Chris? So it's good that we can have this opportunity. I've really enjoyed watching the other interviews, so great to be here.
I wanted to start off initially just talking a bit about digital. So all of the conversations I've been having, digital transformation seems to be picking up pace, I think, through the pandemic. And I suppose I wanted to ask, from your point of view, I mean, do you think that are you seeing the businesses fundamentally changed as a result of the pandemic? And how's that developing in terms of your clients and what you're seeing?
It's a great question about the fundamental changes that are taking place in the pandemic. I think that is shifting a lot of consumer behavior. So there's some interesting research that suggests that brand loyalty is considerably eroded. And that means that we're bound to see some movement in where customers are. Of course, we've seen a considerable change in the way that customers are interacting with services, and perhaps not necessarily in the UK, which already had quite a large online presence, but in some countries, huge swings towards online services that didn't exist before. And then linked to all that, the whole sort of hybrid working. So all those things are digital in one way, both the way that employees are engaged and the way that customers are engaged. So I think through all of those things, I think the genie's out of the bottle. I think that I don't think that we're going to go back to where we are. Whether we've seen right now a radical change, that's a different question. But whether that will unravel over the coming years, I really do believe that will be happening. For example, from an employee perspective, I can't see how white collar and professional services, particularly in financial services, kind of where I operate in, that can ever go back to full-time office working. Same with customers. I can't imagine that customers will ever really want to go back to full-time sort of entering into branches. So I do see that there will be irrevocable changes, but whether they are, they've taken place and they're never going back now, or whether we'll see that unravel over the next couple of years, I think we can only watch and see. Really, it ought to all be about the customer, right? So it would be what makes it better for the customer, what reduces to use a sort of digital phrase, the friction in the customer's journey. How does it make the customer's life easier? But digital's not always about that. There are elements of the sharp end of digital which definitely are about making things more efficient for a business. So when we think about the journey, but we can also think about optimizing the operations as well. So where's the motivation? I think it's going to be a mixture of those motivations, depending on the industry that's at play, depending on the maturity of that organization in terms of their digitalization, and what's at play. I think it's really contextual as to where the driver's coming from. I think that, as I said earlier, though, I think there are some fundamentals. I think that if one thing that the pandemic has done is it's just forced the change upon people. So I think a lot of businesses were considering a switch to delivering their services online, or they were considering a switch to more hybrid models, or perhaps using Teams and things like this that we're on, and they were sort of pondering it. And what the pandemic did was push everybody into a live experiment. So it's sped that development curve up in a way that without it, we would probably still be thinking about it rather than doing it.
I suppose one of the things we've definitely seen over the last year or so has been digital processes and digital payment platforms. I mean, buy now, pay later is probably one of the ones that's really sort of grown over the last 6 months, year, I would say. And even now they're talking about it sort of ramping up into like pre-Christmas spend. I mean, where do you think the legacy is for buy now, pay later over the longer term? And there seems like there's been regulatory clouds sort of around it, potentially more regulation that's coming through. I mean, what's your kind of view on that in terms of like where the industry goes from here?
That's a very big answer coming up here, so I'll try my best to articulate it properly. I mean, buy now, pay later is part of a wider phenomenon of embedded finance. So embedded finance, placing banking products or financial services products into existing customer journeys in a seamless way, so that not that customers don't realize, but that it's just easier for a customer. I mean, you may remember, certainly I remember my dad, buying a second-hand car back in, I don't know when it would have been, a couple of decades ago. And, we'd go get the car, and then he'd have to go to the bank, and the bank manager would say yes. And then he'd go the next day, and he'd get given a brown envelope with the cash in it. And then he'd go get the car.
Yeah.
And it was ridiculous. And, embedded finance places that whole financial decision making within the journey of purchase. And buy now, pay later is very much the sort of thin end of the wedge there. It's a great example of, I have this existing journey, whatever it might be for. Let's kind of use clothes because it's a really good example. I'm buying this item of clothing, and I get to the checkout, and I choose to buy now, pay later. A couple of clicks, and it's done. So that is really, really interesting for so many reasons. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that younger demographics are not so interested in revolving credit like older demographics. So there's a credit angle there. There's a brand angle there. Some of these buy now, pay later brands are destination brands in themselves. So what bank has a head of fashion, but buy now, pay later providers do. So there's a whole other angle there. So buy now, pay later, I think one way or another, it will exist. I think that we've seen huge growth in this market, and we're bound to see some consolidation in this market into in the coming years. And we're also bound to see some regulation. It's coming to the second part of your question. So earlier this year, the government had a paper on this. There was the Woolard Review, and then an exploratory paper around it. And really, the key takeaways in the UK are that there needs to be a better affordability assessment, something that you and I have obviously know from our work in credit operations. Banks are very good at that, almost like to the nth degree. And buy now, pay later hasn't really had that, because it uses a soft check at the point of sale, and moreover, it doesn't really look at the multiple relationships that a buy now, pay later customer may have. The other thing is the review asked about outcomes. So it really is asking the FCA to look again at whether its current regulations are delivering on what it wants. I mean, this point about the kind of like the multiple buy now, pay later products is a good example. So it's outcome based. Do we really know how many buy now, pay later products somebody has? And then the last thing is about good debt advice, which I've seen banks. I'm not saying banks are exemplar, but I've seen them becoming increasingly better at this, and taking much more care over their customers with debt advice, particularly ones that are vulnerable. And it's evident that some of these organisations right now have relatively immature credit operations and care in that regard that needs to get better. I'm not decrying them, but I think that even they would kind of have to hold their hand up and say that they're not at the level of maturity of any of the established banks.
So we talked a bit about frictionless journeys just then. So there's been some conversations, interesting conversations around when do you need to introduce friction, and you could even say the affordability process is a need to introduce friction, because you want to make sure that people can really afford it. And that comes into almost like a bit of a conversation around when do you need to have friction, or when do you need to have human interaction, which is a type of friction. I mean, have you seen that sort of like starting to come up into sort of rather than just being as smooth as possible? I mean, should it just be as smooth as possible, or should you actually have areas where you need to have design friction in as well?
Yeah, plan for friction. I can't say myself I'm keen on it, but I do recognise the need for the need for pause for thought around credit. I mean, sensible lending is very, very important, and that people should understand and know that they're in a credit agreement is really, really important. So if the lack of friction means that customers don't realise they're borrowing money, then clearly there's a problem, right? So I get that. But as a sort of a digital purist, you know, I like the idea of frictionless journeys. Friction, you know, there's the multiple ways that friction can be put in a journey, or so say exists in a journey. One is people, so that people might be serving in that journey, or that people themselves might make mistakes when they're in that journey. There is the process itself, and how cumbersome that process is. There is, from a financial services perspective, the nature of money. So how do we exchange? There is paper in traditional processes, and then there is also premises in traditional processes, and all of those things that I've said, you'll notice that traditional banks are encumbered by. So there, yeah, I'm sort of on this point of adding friction for a reason. I think where it's legitimate, and there is pause for thought, I think that's fair. Your second part of your question was, am I seeing it? On the whole, no. On the whole, I'm not seeing it. I hear the call for it, but the clients that I work with, on the whole, are wanting to eliminate friction as best as possible in an ethical way, but want to eliminate that as much as possible, because the consumer's experience is increasingly like that outside financial services. So you use Netflix or Uber, or any really slick digital experience. What degree of friction do you have there? Very, very minimal. So as customers get used to using, are using digital services, increasingly financial services is set in that context and judged against them. So we're increasingly seeing that people just want frictionless digital financial journeys too.
Do you think there's a need for human interaction, or where would you put that, or where would you plan for that if you're doing a digital transformation kind of program? I mean, is there a need for it at all, or how would you think about when that's needed?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I challenge the question by saying, like, what is human? So what is human and what is digital? So you and I are having this conversation. We're hundreds of miles apart, but it's human, right? So at the same time, I could be sat next to somebody who could even put their hand on my shoulder. They're that close, but it could be a terrible interaction, and there could be no presence whatsoever. So what is human and what is digital? And as we move towards more immersive technologies, you may have heard this term of Metaverse and Web3, which we may want to talk about, that what is human and what is digital is going to become ever more increasingly difficult to distinguish. So so that's the first point. I think the second point is research that I'd done previously suggests that there tends to be a point for most people when they might want some human interaction. So if you're a digital native, it might be scarcely ever. But if you're somebody that's come to digital late, it might be quite high frequency and very readily that you require it. And in a financial services journey, that's mapped on in a different way, because there's not only how digitally savvy you are, there's how financially savvy you are. You can almost see the 2x2 matrix, and therefore how often you might need interaction and what that interaction might be might differ. So I might want at a certain point in a journey to have a chatbot, or it might be that I need to speak to you on a video call, or it might be that I just want to abandon it and go and see somebody. I mean, the key thing about digital processes is that if whatever I choose, let's say I choose to stop my journey and I need to speak to somebody, that I can stop that journey and I go into the branch and I meet somebody and they pick up that journey at precisely the same point, and they have all that context. That's the power that digital can bring you. But ultimately, everybody has a point, I think, particularly in complex financial journeys. So let's say a very complicated pension arrangement, or a high-end mortgage, that it's just such a significant part of what you're working towards, that you need that assurance of some human interaction some way.
Yeah, I suppose some of it comes down to also like the design as well, right? So how do you design even the digital journey? So, for example, I mean, it can be quite, at one end, maybe it's sort of bookmarked by, a design that is very sort of linear. It can be sort of like it's, very sort of engineered, very logical, but that might not be necessarily how the client kind of works. And there's almost like, so how much of a role of almost like that human-centered design comes into like great digital experiences, and can that stop then the requirement for the human interaction?
Yeah, I think there's something here. From a gaming experience, actually, there's so many multiplayer games that are sort of open-ended, and they're designed open-ended rather than linearly. When we were kids, perhaps computer games were left to right. You did play Donkey Kong, you had to go up. There was a beginning and there was an end. But now, gaming is done where you can do multiple things in multiple orders, over different times. And so the design of those and the open-ended design of this really is seeping out into other digital experiences and other digital processes. So increasingly, I'm seeing an open-ended thought process to the way that consumers engage digitally. And to your point, that has to be human-centered. It has to begin with, where is this person? What is their life like? What are their needs? How does financial services sit within their needs? How does financial services sit within all the other services that they need to acquire? And what's their thought process when they need it? And how do they interact with it? And then once they've purchased it, how do they want to continue that? And that's not linear. That's anything but linear. That is, completely open-ended.
So you mentioned earlier, or we chatted earlier a little bit about metaverse, I suppose, and that almost like this virtual kind of world that's been sort of talked about. It's been trailed quite a lot in the press. I mean, what's your kind of view on that in terms of like how that would then start to kind of flow through? I mean, we've talked quite a bit about AI before, and I suppose this is almost like on a different level. And what's your interpretation of the noise that's kind of going on with that, and whether that will sort of like play out?
There is a heck of a lot of noise. You're right, and I think really the mainstream that was kicked off by Facebook changing its name. That's kind of what brought it to the attention of most people. But the metaverse has been on the horizon for digital aficionados for quite some time. First of all, let's just sort of be clear what it is. The metaverse is well, we're building it, right? And we're building it. We can't quite see what it is. So it's a little bit primordial at this point. I think it has to be said, but it's incredibly exciting. So it's the convergence of the digital and the physical. It is the grand union of immersive experience. It is, if you can imagine, an internet that you can be inside, and that is a really exciting point of development of the internet. In the first iteration of the internet, connected us to information. We even kind of invented a word for it, didn't we? The information superhighway, which you haven't heard for decades. And then the next thing that happened was we connected people. We connected people through social media. But the next iteration of the internet is going to connect. It's going to connect people. It's going to connect places. It's going to connect things, and we're going to be part of it. Now, it strikes me that that such a fundamental change, where people can actually earn a living in a virtual world. If they wanted to, they could live there. It would be a pretty daft thing to do, I guess, but they could spend a lot of their time there. They could certainly earn a living there, and over time it will develop its own economy. That financial services will have to respond to that, and the nature of banking, the nature of insurance, the nature of wealth management, the nature of all financial services could be fundamentally different to the way that we comprehend it today, because it has to respond to that. I mean, if you think about the starting point of that, I mean, you have the opportunity to buy virtual real estate, and people are spending a considerable amount of money buying land in virtual real estate. People are buying NFTs, non-fungible tokens of what they might be, collectible cards or pieces of art. So and why are they doing that? Well, they're doing it because that's where they want to spend their time. They're buying virtual sneakers and you know, all sorts of things. So in such a world, in such a different place to where we are now, I can't articulate how banking will be different, but what you can say is, yeah, do you know what? Yeah, it's going to have to respond to that. It's going to have to be a new kind of financial services if in maybe not next year, but 10, 20, 30 years from now, people are spending their time there, they're working there, they're you know, spending a fundamental part of their life in that, that banking and financial services will have to respond to that.
Yeah. And what about remote working? I mean, what have you seen in terms of that? And what do you think the future is in terms of remote working or hybrid models or going back to the office? I mean, we sort of felt like we're gradually starting to move back into the office, certainly in the UK over the last little while. And with Omicron coming through, it feels like that's sort of like stalled, and we're now sort of feeling like we're increasingly going back into working remotely again. I mean, what's your view on the future of that, and what does it mean? I mean, are we ever going to land on one, or is it always going to be sort of moving around?
It's a really great question because it's tied up with you know, you've got business's reaction and what business wants to do, but then you have this, you know, groundswell of, well, what do people want to do? And it, you know, it has a name, doesn't it? The Great Resignation, and people are changing what they want to do as well. And so the future and what will happen will be the convergence of those two things. So on the one hand, you see people, let's say they've invested a lot of money in a degree, and they have a professional job, and then they look across and say, well, hang on a minute, the people at Amazon warehouse are earning more than me. Why am I doing this? I'm going to quit, and I'm going to go do that. So you've got that. You have people perhaps late in their career that got caught in the pandemic, which are thinking, well, I don't want to go back now. I've thought about it. I've enjoyed myself being at home, and I'm not going to go back. Or equally, you have people in retirement that perhaps have built up assets and think, well, I can start to share them with my family and stuff. So you've got kind of all of these cultural things that are happening, as well as the business stuff. Now, on the business, so how does that play itself out? Well, recruitment is really hot right now. I mean, it's certainly in skilled jobs. It's crazy hot, and in semi-skilled jobs, vacancies are soaring. How would people normally react? Well, employers would normally put their wages up. Well, what will happen in low skilled work if people put wages up? Well, prices will go up. Well, will people be prepared to pay £2 or £3 for a Greg sausage roll? I don't think so. So what will happen? Well, we're bound to see much more automation and digitization deployed into those businesses. I'm not saying Greg's are going to replace everybody with a robot. Don't write in. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that shrewd businesses are going to digitize and automate processes with technology as much as possible to keep themselves competitive. And we'll see people move into different kinds of work. You know, more service businesses, teaching personal fitness, or doing yoga, or teaching language, or and all these different things which didn't even exist really. Some of that stuff over because it's delivered over social media, even in a few years ago. So how the business is going to respond? They're going to have to be kind of really comprehensive. I said right at the beginning, I think the genie's out of the bottle. I just don't think that businesses can go back to how they were, and certainly in professional lines of work, we will. The hybrid model's here to stay. Whether that will be 100%, 90%, 80%, or whether it'll be 10%, I don't know. But that hybrid model is here to stay. But that has a lot of implications. I think in FS, the one thing that I think is the major implication is security. During the pandemic, I think regulators were very they turned a blind eye to some of this, to some degree, to some of the security implications that exist. And now that needs to be put under the microscope again. So, if you have dispersed technologies and contact centers, etc., where customer details are popping up, that's a very, very important thing to get hold of and understand. So I think from an FS perspective, that's key. I think from a businesses themselves perspective, HR have a massive role. I mean, they have a huge role to ensure that there is a supportive and positive employee experience, and that's going to be around health and safety. It's going to be around a large part around mental health and making sure people are right. Training is going to be deployed virtually in a much more dynamic way. Maybe that will be delivered with on-demand content, and I think HR need to digitize a lot of their processes as well, so they can respond very quickly. So it might not be that you always have to speak to the HR manager. There might be some sort of digital assistant and chatbot. So I think HR as a function within businesses both has to think about transforming itself and also think about the way that it helps the business transform into this world as well.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic for me is almost like it threw everything up in the air, and it's almost like the longer everything's up in the air, the more likely it's going to change. And it's been up in the air for, I mean, even with the changes now, right? It's gone up in the air a little bit again. The longer it's going to be fundamental, and this is almost like it feels like, is this like a fundamental turning point where we move into something new? And if you move into something new, I certainly me personally, or maybe and businesses as well, it's like we want to try and find islands of stability when everything's changing. And what is that? So my island of stability might have been being back in the office, but if I can't do that, I need to find a new one. And is hybrid working the new island of stability? Like, it's going to be flexible, but it's going to be stable, if you see what I mean. And I just wonder if it's that search for stability is sort of what's going to be kind of on. As you were talking, I was thinking that. We're trying to find areas where we can a model that can be stable as a business, but it's going to be flexible to take and be able to adapt for all these other changes that might be thrown at us.
Yeah, it's a great point, and what you're making me think is like, what will stable be in the future? Because the speed of change is increasing all the time. And this might be stable where we are now. I mean, this might be this might be stability, but it's just that we're not quite used to it, or some of us are not quite used to it. So I think there's a with the speed of technological change, what is stability is a really important point. Just on the question of hybrid, and just so we capture it, I do think that businesses do have a responsibility to employees where it's just not appropriate for them. So let's say that you're just joining the workforce. So you are a school leaver, or you're a graduate. You need some degree of human interaction to learn how business works. When I first started work, how does this work? How does that work? Oh, go and ask Jean. She's worked here for 20 years, and you just stumble across people in a way. Whereas if you have to formalize every conversation that you have and have to book it in, you don't get those learnings that you would have had. You also don't understand the brand of an organization. So just pointing at a logo doesn't give you a sense of the culture. And we're going to have to learn new ways of helping people get to terms with that. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be in the office to understand what that means, but you're going to have to be much more demonstrative about how we deliver that, because previously what a brand meant internally was almost imbued by it wasn't done deliberately. And then the other point is that some people may be in a vulnerable position. They may be subject to domestic violence at home, or they may just not have the facility to work from home in an appropriate way. And businesses, or certainly large-scale businesses that have the capacity to do so, really should feel that they have a duty of care to provide the appropriate place for people to do their work if working from home is not right for them.
Well, Wayne, thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Super interesting, as all of our chats always are. So, I really appreciate it. That was fantastic. So, thanks very much.
It's been a lot of fun, Chris. Really appreciate the conversation. Thanks a lot.